Hi, Jake Williams from Rendition InfoSec here. I wanted to touch on something that's blown up the Twitters this morning, and I see a lot of news syndicated about this already. I've got a lot of students asking me about this as well as clients. Should we trust PGP? Wow. First off, yes. TLDR, if you can't watch any more of the video, the answer is yes, continue to trust PGP. Don't worry about it. The reality here is that if you've had your software updated and you continue to update your software, you're likely to not be vulnerable to this in any way, shape, or form. That said, there are some email clients that support active content and don't include basically a message validation. Or don't alert the user that the message validation is broken, right? So another thing that folks have asked about, is another question that I've had asked before I get into some of the details here, on thoughts, is can an attacker using this technique extract my private key? Because there's some question about, there's some note about the fact that, quote, even if the emails were collected years ago, right, they could still be vulnerable to this attack. And folks are taking this to mean that your key is being leaked. That is absolutely not the case, right? In this case, what they're talking about is that if you collected an email from a target years ago, you could modify the encrypted email, send it to the user, and then as they decrypt it with the active content portion there, that active content could then send the decrypted contents to the attacker, right? So that said, let's talk a little about Efail. Right? This is InfoSec hype at its worst, right? I want to start by noting that indeed there really is a problem, right? Obviously CVEs, there were 2 CVEs issued for this. There were actually 2 different techniques. One of them involves S-MIME with cipher block chaining, which is actually not the S-MIME piece specifically, but CBC modification, cipher block chaining modification. That's something that we actually talk about in the SANS 660 course. We teach it. It's something that always floors people, that you can do some of this stuff. So the technique itself is not old. The technique itself is old. It's not new. What is new is the application to attacking S-MIME. So again, this is a technique that's, again, so pedestrian. It's been part of a SANS course for a huge number of years, and I don't know where else to go with it from there, right? Just to say that, is this a logo-worthy vulnerability? I think the answer there is no. I also want to talk about, rather than the technical side, since we now know that A, update your software, B, you don't need to worry about someone stealing your private keys. That's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. Since we know that, maybe now kind of drop back and talk about the disclosure process itself. Apparently, the researchers claimed that they had this under embargo, and when the embargo broke, even after they did some partial disclosure, the embargo broke, and they said, "Hey, time to dump full details out here." Realistically, at this point, all of your press jumps on this like flies to poop, and I use that analogy intentionally because, look, I think the majority of this is much ado about nothing. Unfortunately, the press reporting on this has not been particularly great either, right? So we start with a couple of researchers who, in all honesty, overhyped a vulnerability, and we move into from there the fact that we have press now who are echoing the contents of basically the researchers' positions and talking about what a big deal it is. I believe we've had some folks recommend that you should just disable PGP entirely. I can't argue against that recommendation highly enough. Don't disable PGP. Absolutely continue to use PGP. Your mail, even if your mail client is vulnerable to this, you're still safer doing that than you are sending unencrypted email. I mean, okay, if the answer is this, look, is a patched client, one that's not vulnerable, better than a unpatched client or one that is vulnerable? Of course it is, right? Is this the end of the world? Is this a big vulnerability? I think the answer here is no. Right, so I have a couple of calls to action for the community. I would say one, I'd start with saying that be honest about the actual impacts of the vulnerability. And listen, I know, sometimes there's anchoring bias that goes on. You discovered a vulnerability. It is neat, right? I'll be flat out and say, look, I had no idea, like most people, that some of our modern clients were still vulnerable to something that had been fixed 18 years ago. Didn't know that, right? But vulnerable in what way, right? Leaking contents of the emails after they've been decrypted, if and only if your client slash plugin supports grabbing resources from external parties using HTML embedded tags. Okay, cool. That is some people in some configurations, right? No question about that. Does this deserve the amount of media attention that it's getting? No. All right, no question about that. We have more important things, honestly, to worry about, and this is taking attention away from a lot of those things. Secondarily, I want to talk about the media response, right? The media jumped on this because it is click-worthy, and look, I don't doubt that it's getting clicks. You not writing a story about it is probably more problematic than you writing a bad story about it as a reporter. That said, again, the reporting has been largely irresponsible in that we've seen a lot of recommendations, bad recommendations, about disabling PGP and saying don't send encrypted email. Well, again, obviously there's a reason that email and encrypted email, for that matter, exist, and saying don't do this implies somehow that you're better off without it. No, without a doubt, that's not the case, right? So, I would say as a call to action for the community in the future, I would say two things, right? One, don't overhype your vulnerabilities. If you have a vulnerability disclosure to make, get some outside opinions on this, right? Get a couple experts involved, or NDA or embargo, or whatever you want to call it there. NDA, a little bit more specific on the legal side, and have them review it, right? If you get some folks together and they're like, yeah, that's not a big deal, then it probably isn't, right? And don't overhype it there, because you're costing yourself credibility down the line. Secondarily, look, from a press standpoint, I understand, again, the desire to and the drivers behind writing about these new and novel vulnerabilities. That said, again, maybe don't just rely on the researchers who are publishing it. They have some skin in the game. Get some outside parties to review before you go to press with horrible recommendations, right? I'll close by saying I don't know anybody who's a serious researcher in the community who looked at this and said, oh my gosh, the sky is falling this morning. That's not the way this played out, right? To read the press right now in InfoSec News, you'd think this was another eternal blue that had been unleashed into the wild. That's simply not the case, right? So again, lots of hype, not a lot of substance. TLDR, not a whole lot to do here. Definitely patch your clients. There will certainly, for any vulnerable client, there will be patches forthcoming. That said, appreciate your time. Jake Williams for Rendition InfoSec. Have a good day.